Good morning, Mercy Hill Church. If I have not had the opportunity to meet you before, my name is Jason, and I'm one of the elders here at Mercy Hill. And I wanted to just start before we get into the message this morning to take the opportunity to say how grateful I am for that to be true. That it is such an honor and it is such a tremendous privilege to be a part of the team that helps lead God's people here at Mercy Hill Church. And there are several ways that being an elder is very rewarding, but I think probably the most rewarding thing for me is just getting the opportunity to bear with you as you go through some of life's really difficult circumstances. Just to listen to you, to cry with you if needed, and to speak gospel truth over you as you try to navigate your way through that circumstance. And those situations are really hard, but what makes it so rewarding is that I have an opportunity that a lot of people don't have. I have it a lot more frequently, at least, is that I get to see time and time again the end of the story and the way that God has continued to show himself to be faithful throughout it and has built up my trust in God so much. And I am so grateful for that. So I wanted to just take the opportunity that I had this morning to say thank you. So thank you for trusting me enough to be vulnerable and to open yourselves up to some of life's most difficult circumstances. But also thank you for the grace that you extend to me as well, as I'm walking through it with you, that I do so imperfectly. Because I think I'm particularly struck by that reality this morning because we're going to be looking at the book of Habakkuk. And the situation that Habakkuk finds himself in is kind of a dire one. He finds himself in one of those circumstances, like I just mentioned, where life is just really difficult for him, and it's led him to start asking some very vulnerable questions. And it's led him to start believing some things about who God is that aren't true, that the very foundational things he believes to be true about who God is are shaking underneath him. And I am aware that for all of us, or at least for most of us in the room, that we've been through circumstances in our lives as well, where we've asked some of these very same questions that Habakkuk finds himself asking as well. And that some of those things that Habakkuk has allowed himself to start believing about God, we've allowed ourselves to start believing about God as well. And I know that for some of us in the room, that maybe that's where you are this morning. That you've walked in the room this morning carrying the weight of a really difficult situation, and what I hope that you hear this morning is that you're not alone. One, that you have a community of people here at Mercy Hill Church who would love nothing more than the opportunity to come alongside you as you walk through that circumstance. But far more importantly, that you have a good God who loves you immeasurably, who has not abandoned you in the midst of it, and one who is completely worthy of your trust this morning as you go through it. So before we get started with Habakkuk, I'd like to just take a moment in prayer. So would you join me in prayer? Oh God, what a privilege it is to be here this morning, just with an opportunity to worship you and hear from your word. Would you remind us all this morning that you are good, that you are loving toward us, and that you are faithful beyond our comprehension. No matter where we find ourselves this morning as we walked in, that we would walk out of those doors more in love with you and with a greater appreciation for all that you've done for us in Christ Jesus. Would you soften the hearts of all of us this morning to receive your words? And would you be with me as I speak? That the words I share would be the words of you, and they'd be the words that Mercy Hill needs to hear. We love you, God, and we trust you. Amen. All right, if you've been with us the past several weeks, you know that we've been going through a sermon series in the Minor Prophets. And like I just mentioned a moment ago, this morning we're going to be in the book of Habakkuk. But before we get started with the book, I wanted to give you just a little bit of context of where we find ourselves this morning. Because you see, the Bible, it's broken up into 66 separate books, but really it tells one cohesive story. It's a story of God not turning his back on humanity in the midst of our wrongdoing. It's a story of God's faithfulness to his people and him keeping his promises. And one promise in particular happened about 4,000 years ago. That there was a man named Abram, and God made a covenant with Abram. He made a promise to Abram. And the promise was that one of Abram's descendants would come and restore the broken relationship that existed between God and man. It was a promise that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through the offspring of Abram, but God's promise of faithfulness did not come certainly without its ups and downs. You see, the people of Israel, the descendants of Abram, they were caught in this just repeated cycle where they would obey God and find security in him, and they would turn away from God and they'd be punished for it. And then eventually you see God's faithfulness in restoring them back to a place where they would obey a God again. And they just go through these ups and downs, this repeated cycle over and over and over again. And I really think that we're not too dissimilar from the Israelites, are we? And there's one thing from my childhood in particular that really made me think of this. And something that you should know about me is that I am a rule follower. Like through and through. You don't really even have to know me that well to know that's true. And I've always been that way. It was actually recently I have 3 brothers, and the 4 of us were with my dad, and the question came up. It's like, well, which one of the kids was the easiest to raise? And we're just like, instantly, he said, Jason. And we're just like, well, why is that? He said, well, if Jason was crying, all you had to do was look at him and say, stop crying. And immediately, silence. Or if I was wandering around doing something, he would just look at me and say, hey, Jason, sit down. And no matter where I was, I would stop and just sit down. So that's true of me. It's like inherent to my nature. I follow rules. I hated getting in trouble as a kid. But there was one thing in particular that I really struggled with. And I had sometimes these events where I would just get so angry. And I would have a really hard time controlling that anger, and something that I'm really not proud of and something I actually deeply regret is that I would oftentimes take out that anger and take out that frustration on one of my brothers. Like we would just get in fist fights all the time. And like good parents should, I would be punished whenever I instigated those events or participated in those events. And there was one time in particular I had gone too far. I knew I had gone way too far. So what I did was that I left the house. So I don't want to be at the house when my dad gets home and sees what happened. And somehow I guess I thought maybe I would get around the punishment or whatever. But not too long after that, I got a call. And it was from my dad. And something that's true about my dad has an extremely calm disposition. Like it takes a lot to get him agitated or riled up. Like less than on one single hand I can count the times I've ever heard him talk in a voice above like normal speaking voice. But when I picked up the phone from my dad that day, I knew that I had really messed up this time. And when I got home, I'll just say that I rightfully got the punishment that I deserved for my actions. And you know what I didn't do for a while? I didn't get into fights with my brother. Because the punishment that I received, it was fresh on my mind. But you know what happened a few months later, as enough time went on? I started to forget the punishment. I forgot how bad the punishment was, and I still had these emotions, and I would allow those emotions to control my actions, and I would just do the same thing over and over again. It was just this constant cycle, just like the Israelites. They were caught in the cycle of obeying God and then turning away from him. And where we pick up the story of Habakkuk this morning is in one of those downturned times for Israel. They've turned away from God, and now punishment is out on the horizon. And you enter the prophet Habakkuk, and this is a man who's trying his best to honor and to serve God, but he's surrounded by people who are doing openly wicked things. In fact, injustice and idolatry were just running rampant throughout the nation of Israel. And it was the leaders who were actually instigating it. They're the leaders, the ones who were most responsible for it, participating in it and leading the people of Israel to do those things. So what we get in the book of Habakkuk, it's a little unique. It's actually just a back and forth dialogue between the prophet and God himself. And I think a lot of the things that this back and forth dialogue has is important for us to see this morning. So we're gonna hit a lot of topics, and we're gonna make some pit stops along the way. But so would you now pick up with me chapter 1, verse 2 of Habakkuk, and we'll see Habakkuk's first dialogue with God. It says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me, strife and contention arise, so the law is paralyzed, and injustice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." Now, I think this first complaint from Habakkuk is actually really telling. And I think there are two things in particular that I see that are really troubling the prophet Habakkuk here. And the first one, if you were to look again at the beginning of verse 4, it says, "So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth." There's this seeming idleness on God's part to withhold punishment for the wrongdoing that the Israelites are committing. In Habakkuk, being someone who's trying to follow God's rule, he's surrounded by these people who are just openly doing these evil and wicked things, and in his eyes, they deserve punishment for it. But God isn't bringing that punishment yet, and he's confused. And in Habakkuk's eyes, justice is not going forward because those people are not getting what they deserve, according to Habakkuk. But there's a second thing that's troubling the prophet Habakkuk as well. If you look at the tail end of verse 4, it says, "For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." And I'm not sure if you're really catching this or not, but what Habakkuk has done, he's kind of created this like moral hierarchy in his mind. And to Habakkuk, it would be something like Habakkuk being up here, someone who's righteous and is doing well, and the rest of Israel down here. But the thing that's particularly troubling for the prophet Habakkuk is that what he sees as the reward for their actions is almost inverted. That the favor that's being received from the people who are openly doing these wicked things is that actually the ones who are benefiting from it, and Habakkuk just cannot comprehend why that's true. And he cries foul here. And I understand that. He actually takes the first complaint that he had about God one step further. It's not just that God is idle in the way that he's handling wrongdoing, is that God is actually responsible for injustice himself. He says justice goes forth perverted, or in other words, that God, you are unjust. And something about the prophet Habakkuk is that being a prophet, like he would have heard all the stories in Israel's history of the ways that God had been faithful, and the stories of how God had been just. He would have heard them. He would have studied them. And as being a prophet, he likely would have taught them to other people as well. But in this moment, what he intellectually understands to be true about God is not matching up with the circumstance that he finds himself in. He's having a hard time wrapping his mind around that. And it's what's actually led him to do is it's actually led him to start doubting whether or not God is actually just or not. And I wonder if for Habakkuk that maybe he's starting to question whether or not those stories that he had heard about who God was, that maybe that's all they were. That maybe they're just stories. Stories meant to make us feel good in hard times, but not actually depicting a real and true God who exists. And I wonder, for many of us in the room this morning, if that's where we find ourselves too. And I'd be willing to bet that most of us have asked a similar question before and wrestled with these same kinds of doubts and questions that Habakkuk is asking as well. And if that's you this morning, you're not alone. That's where Habakkuk finds himself too, the prophet of God. The very foundational things that he believes to be true about who God is beginning to crumble around him. And what he's doing now is that he's begging God to respond. So let's look together at God's response. Let's begin in chapter 1, verse 5. "Look among the nations and see. Wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own." Now, I didn't mention the Chaldeans earlier when I was giving the context, and it seems like now maybe would be a good time to do so. So in Habakkuk's lifetime, there was really like one main like powerhouse nation that kind of ruled, and that was the empire of Assyria. In fact, Assyria had already come in and conquered the northern half of the nation of Israel, and where Habakkuk finds himself is in the southern half. It's the half that's managed to elude Assyria's captivity up to this point. But Assyria is a real threat. They have the strongest army in the world. They've conquered a pretty sizable portion of the known world at that time. Well, that is until the Chaldeans show up on the scene. And the way that God describes them here is bitter and hasty, dreaded and fearsome, lovers of violence, and he summarizes it in verse 11. He says, guilty men, whose own might is their God. This is a violent group of people who have just overthrown the most powerful empire in the world at the time and taken captivity of a city called Babylon. So yes, another word that you could call the Chaldeans is the Babylonians. And if you're familiar with the story of the Bible, at least with the book of Daniel, the Babylonians might sound familiar. And if you are familiar with that story, you actually know exactly how the story ends for the people of Israel here. Because the book of Daniel was written during Israel's time in exile in Babylon. But the book of Habakkuk is written before the Babylonian takeover. But they are starting to close in on all sides. They're kind of beginning to apply that pressure around them. And the extraordinary thing that God is telling Habakkuk here is that he is raising up the Chaldeans, this bitter and hasty nation, to punish the nation of Israel, God's chosen people. See, Habakkuk thinks that God is overlooking Israel's wrongdoing, but what God says in response to this, not only do I see the injustice that's being done, I'm doing something about it as well. But I have to believe, like God must have known that this was going to be really difficult for the prophet Habakkuk to receive, right? Which is why he says in verse 5, he says, I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. And now I've actually heard this verse taken out of its context on several occasions, like something to the effect of like, oh, God is just doing something so amazing, so immaculate that you just couldn't even comprehend it if he tried to tell it to you. And there is a reality that God works all things for good, right? Like he sees the end goal and he's working to it, and nothing is going to stop him from accomplishing what is good for us and what is glorious to him. That's true. But make no mistake that these words by God to the prophet Habakkuk here would not have been pleasant words. Habakkuk would have understood exactly what God was telling him. That God was using an evil nation to punish God's chosen people. And can you just imagine for a moment like being in Habakkuk's shoes? Like, do you remember all those promises that God had given the people of Israel? That he had chosen them, that he had promised to be faithful to them, that he had promised to give them a land that they now currently lived in and had been living in for 800 years. For 800 years. And if my math is correct, next year, the United States will celebrate its 250th birthday. So for more than 3 times longer than the United States has existed as a country, Israel has lived in this land that they're currently dwelling in. And just like that, it seems like all those promises that God had made to Israel are now in jeopardy in the eyes of Habakkuk. So let's look together at the way Habakkuk responds to this news. Let's pick up chapter 1, verse 12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of pure eyes and to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? And I think Habakkuk responds pretty much exactly like I would expect him to. Like, effectively what he says is, what? The Chaldeans are even more evil than the people of Israel. In this moral hierarchy that Habakkuk had created in his mind, where it would have been Habakkuk up here, Israel right here, the Chaldeans would have been somewhere way down here. And this just blows Habakkuk away. He struggles to understand how it is that God could be just and allow something like that to happen. You see, God has answered the troublesome question from Habakkuk about, is God just? Yes, God is going to maintain his justice by punishing the wrongdoing of Israel. But God has absolutely poured gasoline on the fire on this ranking system that Habakkuk has. So what Habakkuk is really now asking, the question, if I were to put it in my own words, he's asking, why is it that bad things happen to good people? And that's a question I'd be willing to bet every one of us at some point in our life has asked. It's a question I found myself asking back in March when I was going through a really difficult situation. And it's a really difficult question for us to wrap our minds around. So that's where God is going to turn his attention towards next. But I don't know if you really noticed it or not, but God didn't really address that whole issue in his first response. Like, he stuck mainly to the accusation of him being unjust. And I think there's a reason for that. And I wanted to give you one seemingly random statistic this morning. I'm preaching, so I tend to do that. I just throw random statistics in there. And this random statistic is that in the United States, there are roughly 40,000 toilet-related injuries per year. Yeah, 40,000 toilet-related injuries in the U.S. per year. And unfortunately for me, I found myself on the wrong side of that statistic back in 2008. And long story short, and honestly to withhold some of the more gross details of this incident, is that I was part of a team who was remodeling this room. And the room was a bathroom. And we'll kind of just overlook the fact that I, as an 11-year-old, was doing construction. I was just destined to fail, right? But during this remodeling process, while we were remodeling this bathroom, one of the toilets that was attached to the wall ended up breaking. Someone gave a gasp, and I think that's because you know exactly where the story is going. And for those of you who don't and might be asking, yes, porcelain can be incredibly sharp, which is a lesson I learned the hard way when I ended up with about a 4-inch cut on the lower portion of my left leg that needed 18 stitches. But before I could get the stitches, the wound needed to be cleaned. And the wound needed to be numbed, which required them pouring alcohol into that open wound. One last detail for those who are more squeamish, it required them administering shots directly into the cut itself. 6 shots, to be more exact. And guys, this is a necessary process, right? We need to do this stuff so that the wound doesn't get infected and it can heal properly. But let me tell you, the whole cleaning process thing was significantly more painful than just getting the cut itself. And I think what we had with God's first response was the cleaning of the wound. And it was painful for the prophet Habakkuk. And I think for a lot of us, when we're in situations like this, it can sometimes feel like God is just pouring the alcohol onto that fresh wound. But guys, it's what you need to heal. And now that God has cleaned the wound of Habakkuk, the great physician can now turn his attention towards stitching it back up. So let's pick back up in chapter 2, verse 2. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. And listen to this next verse right here. This is the most impactful verse in the entire book of Habakkuk, verse 4. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. And if you're right now, like me, as I was studying the text, you might be asking the questions like, who is it in verse 4 that God is actually directing this comment towards? Like when he says, behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him, who is he talking about? And admittedly, the text does not explicitly tell us who he's talking about, and there's actually some debate among scholars even about who it is, and there's really two options. The first option is that he's talking about the Chaldeans. And we saw how God referred to the Chaldeans back in chapter 1, and if you were to read the rest of chapter 2, like God's opinion of the Chaldeans certainly does not lighten up. So I think it is a very legitimate possibility that God is referring to the Chaldeans here. But there's another option, and that God is actually talking to Habakkuk. And this is honestly the interpretation that I lean towards, and what I believe that God is doing is that he is just dropping an absolute bomb on this whole hierarchy system that Habakkuk has created in his mind. That Habakkuk has reached the conclusion that God is unjust because bad things keep happening to him. And with just this one phrase, God comes by and sweeps the legs out from underneath that argument. I think what he's saying to Habakkuk is something along the lines of, your soul is puffed up. You're not thinking about things rightly. You're operating with a lot of pride in your heart. And I'll tell you why I think that's what God is telling the prophet Habakkuk right here. You see that phrase, the righteous shall live by his faith? That phrase is actually quoted 3 times in the New Testament. It's in Romans 1, it's in Galatians 3, and it's in Hebrews 10. And in all 3 of those occurrences, what the author is communicating to the audience is that your right standing with God, the means by which you have gained life through Christ, has nothing to do with your actions. And that it has everything to do with your faith in God. See, the Galatian church at that time, they were starting to really struggle with that concept. They were starting to believe this idea that somehow their actions were necessary in order to gain them right standing with God, so Paul has to address it. And he does so in Galatians 3, and this is what he tells them. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, that is, by our actions. For the righteous shall live by his faith." This may seem like harsh words from the apostle here. But the reason that Paul is so passionate about this idea that they have to understand that their right standing with God has nothing to do with themselves and everything to do with God. Because without that fact, there is no gospel. The good news of Jesus is that he accomplished for you what you could never accomplish on your own. So if you remove this idea of God getting you salvation through faith alone, you've actually removed the gospel entirely. There is no good news apart from that reality, which is why Paul gets so animated when he's communicating that point so clearly to the Galatians. And the verse that Paul uses to drive that point home is located right here in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. The righteous shall live by his faith. So what God is trying to communicate to Habakkuk is that the means by which you have life, the means by which you are counted righteous in the eyes of God has always been and will always be based on faith in God, and not based on your actions like Habakkuk has convinced himself is true. Because that hierarchy that Habakkuk has created, he keeps pointing back to his own actions as the means to justify his stance that he's righteous. Like, he's used that word righteous to describe himself twice already. Back in chapter 1, the wicked swallows up the righteous. At the end of chapter 1, the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he. He's trying to justify himself. He's saying, all these evil things keep happening to me, a man who's righteous. Just look at all the things I've done. Look at me in comparison to these wicked people. Why do these bad things keep happening to me? But what God says is that the righteous shall live by his faith. And I think what God is doing here is that he's actually presenting a challenge to Habakkuk. What he's saying is that there is a true mark, a clear identifier of someone who is truly righteous. Is that you will live your life by trusting God. That's the positive way of saying it. The righteous shall live by his faith. But the negative way of saying it, and make it more personal to Habakkuk, what he's really telling Habakkuk is that if you were righteous, you would trust me. So the challenge has been laid out before Habakkuk, that if he really is someone who is righteous, he'll start trusting God. And this is not as a way to earn his righteousness, but to start identifying with those who already are righteous. That we like to think that our salvation in God, or our relationship with God, is this one-time event of us placing our faith in God, and we just continue to live the rest of our lives however we want. And that's just not true. You step from faith into faith. That every single aspect of your life is meant to be marked by trusting in God, not just some one-time event that you did by placing your faith in Jesus. So that means even in the midst of difficulty, even when you don't understand why things are happening around you the way that they are, even if you were to somehow think that you would do things better if you were the one in control and not God. See, faith in God should be present in every aspect of our lives. Faith in God should be present in the relationships we have with one another. Faith in God should be present in the way that we manage and use our finances. Faith in God should be present in the way that we talk about and respect our bosses and the people in authority above us. What he's saying is that God doesn't want just part of your heart. He wants the whole thing. So every aspect of your life is meant to be marked by that reality, by trusting in who God is. And at this point, I think there are two responses that I typically see from people who find themselves in the situation that Habakkuk's in right now, who have reached some conclusion because they've built up these arguments, and they kind of had someone come in and just knock down those arguments away from them. And the first way that I typically see people respond is that they can double down in their conclusion. Even though they don't have any arguments to support that claim anymore, they just double down. They speak out of their pride, and they allow their emotions to affect their decision-making. And there's a chance that what this indicates that they were never interested in what was true after all. That they were only interested in being right and not doing what was right. And guys, that's a really scary place to be, especially when we're dealing with the things of God. But there's a second way I typically will see people respond in this situation, and it's that in their humility, they're one to what is true. And guys, honestly, it really does. It takes a lot of humility to do something like that. To lay aside what you want to be true for the sake of what is true. And guys, that's what living by faith should look like in our lives. So the question that we have for Habakkuk, the one question that's still left standing here is, which option is Habakkuk going to walk through? Which one is he going to choose? So let's find out together. Jump with me now to the end of the book. It's chapter 3, verse 17, and then after that we'll close. He says, Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Habakkuk is driven in his humility toward God. And what's something that's really striking in this instance is that his circumstances actually did not change. But his mindset did a complete 180 flip. In fact, we know that within about 10 years of this book being written, that the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, would indeed come. And they would send them into exile where they would be in captivity for 70 years. But what Habakkuk says is that no matter if they go into captivity, no matter if he starves by the fields yielding no food, no matter if his livelihood would be cut off, he will rejoice in the Lord. What changed? His circumstances didn't change, but what changed from God presenting that challenge to Habakkuk back in chapter 2, verse 4, and Habakkuk's response right here at the end of chapter 3? What changed? And if you go back and were to read the rest of chapter 3, what you'll see is that the prophet Habakkuk starts to recount all these stories that he's heard in the past, the stories of God's faithfulness to the people of Israel. It's the same stories that he was wondering just 2 chapters previously if maybe they were just make-believe. It's the same stories that led him to doubt the character of God are now the stories that are driving him to see the faithfulness in God and to rely on the hope that's coming in the future. And there's one thing that's kind of tucked in chapter 3. It's just one verse. In verse 13, there's an allusion. I'm not going to read it, but I would really encourage you all to go back and spend some time in chapter 3 at some point this week. There's an allusion to a future king, a descendant of Abram, one who is going to restore the broken relationship between God and man. Does that sound familiar? Church, the difference between us and Habakkuk is not that we should never struggle with doubts. It's not that we should never ask these questions to God. The difference between Habakkuk and us is that Habakkuk had to look forward to the hope that there would one day be that future king that restored the relationship between God and man. And we get the privilege 2,000 years to look back and see the faithfulness of God. That we know that future king personally, and he has a name, and his name is Jesus. So Mercy Hill, my hope for you is that you would look back on the faithfulness of God. Yes, in the stories in the Bible to see the character of God, but also in your own life. See the ways that God has not turned his back on you. See the ways that God time and time again has been faithful towards you, just like he did for Habakkuk, knowing that he will be faithful time and time again into the future as well, even in the midst of life's most difficult circumstances, and that we would live our lives by trusting in God, that we would be righteous people who live their lives by faith. So would you pray with me? What a wonderful truth for us this morning, God. A reminder that you are a God who is faithful, that you are a God who holds true to his promises, that you are a God who has given us everything that we could ever need by taking on human flesh, living the life that we required to live, and for taking the punishment that we deserved on a criminal's cross. Would you allow that reality to sink deeply into our hearts this morning? That we would taste and see that you are good, that we would lay aside our pride and take up trust in who you are. That you were faithful then, and you'll be faithful now. And ultimately, God, that you are a God who is worth our trusting with our entire lives. We love you, Father. And it's in your Son's name that I pray all these things. Amen.